This summer in Moscow, there was a number of special exhibits going on. One on Nikolai Feshin, which was incredible, and then there was this other one on Konstantin Korovin, which was equally as amazing. It was actually a larger exhibit. This one was at the new Trefikov Gallery downstairs, and it took up quite a bit of space. Korovin has always been an artist that has interested me very much, and so it was great to see a retrospective of all his work in one place. Korovin was not only a painter but also a stage designer and a writer. He worked in all genres, landscape, still life, portraits, and he's considered to be one of the most outstanding Russian Impressionist painters. His last exhibit at the Trefikov Gallery was in 1920, and he was very unhappy with that exhibit because it only showed his very early work and not his, more mature pieces. And soon after that exhibit, he immigrated to Paris. Korovin was born in Moscow. His parents were of the merchant class and very well-to-do. His father was a lawyer, and his mother was very much into music and painting. In fact, his brother Sergei and Konstantin's son were both artists. At the age of 14, Korovin entered Moscow's School of Painting and Architecture. He started off as an architecture major, but changed a year later to painting. He was there for 2 years, and during that 2-year period he had 3 very strong teachers. First of which was Vasily Perov, who's very famous for his portrait work. Second is Alexei Savrasov, who's very famous painting The Rooks Have Come. You can see the influence of his work on Korovin with some of Korovan's first early work, like this painting called Last Snow. You can see the color palette is very similar with the raw umber. And this was what I call Russian gray. It's a sort of a use of browns and blues that you don't typically see anywhere but in Russia. And then his third teacher that was probably the largest influence on him was Vasily Polenov. And Vasily Polenov had a house in the suburbs of Moscow, and he was very famous for painting these sort of backyard scenes of the suburban Moscow. Polenov had just returned from Paris, where he'd been learning about the new techniques of the Impressionist painters, and he brought it back to Russia and taught his students. Polenov and Korovin became very close, and soon Korovin was teaching Polenov because Korovin had such a good eye for color. Korovin's country house in the suburbs, Polenov's had a country house in the suburbs, and Korovin visited there a lot, and he painted, these early paintings of his are all done from that period. You can see springtime and wintertime, and he became autumn. He became very close to the family. He even did a really beautiful painting of them at tea. This painting, Portrait of a Chorus Girl, is considered the first of the Russian Impressionist paintings, though the date was actually crossed out, and Korovin wrote in 1883. It was believed that he originally painted this in 1887, but he was trying to beat Valentin Serov's painting of A Girl with Peaches, which was painted in 1887. Next we see some other paintings or painting that he did that has a real impressionist feeling, and you can start to see how loose his brushwork is getting. In 1894, Valentin Serov and Korovin made a trip to the north. They went to Finland, Sweden, and northern Russia. This was financed by Sava Monetov, who was building a railroad through this area, and he wanted the two to do a bunch of paintings to help promote the project. Here we see a portrait of Korovin that Valentin Serov did right when they returned. And Serov is trying to copy Korovin's loose brushwork. You can definitely see it in the hands. And in the back are sketches that the two of them did on this trip. Korovin was very inspired by painting in the northern area, and he felt that there was more variety of color there than he'd ever seen anywhere else. And he continued throughout his life to paint in this area, out in the plein air type painting. These paintings were used to decorate railroad stations, and they actually disappeared right after the 1917 revolution. But several years later, right before this exhibit that was going to happen this summer, these paintings just happened to magically reappear in one of the railroad stations in northern Russia. In 1885, Korovin went on a trip to Paris in Spain, and this trip was also financed by Sava Monetov, and along with them came Mikhail Rubel. And both artists, Rubel and Korovin, were very influenced by this trip. Korovin wrote, "Paris was a shock for me, impressionist. In them I found everything I was scolded for back in Moscow." Korovin was also very inspired by Velázquez and Goya during this trip, and he painted this painting here. At the balcony, Spanish women Lenora and Ampara in 1889, and he got the first place prize in the Paris exhibition when it was shown in 1900. In 1896, there was a huge exhibition in Russia called the All Russia Exhibition, and Korovin used his material from his northern trip to design these very large paintings for a pavilion that was representing the far north of Russia. He painted altogether 10 large canvases, and these were in this exhibition that we saw this summer. And I don't even know how large these were. They were huge, like maybe 20 feet long type things. And they were showing all different aspects of life in northern Russia and the Arctic. And after this exhibition, they were placed in a railroad station in Moscow. With these paintings, you see a different style. Korovin is flattening out his work, very similar to some of the stuff that Gauguin was doing in the Nabis group. It's very stylized. It has kind of an Art Nouveau quality to it, which was, of course, becoming very popular during this time. To understand Korovin, you've got to understand that he was very involved in theater for most of his life. In fact, the theater primarily supported him financially. He began in 1885 working for Sava Monetov's private opera, and then in 1900 he became the designer for the Imperial Theater in Moscow. In 1910 he became the chief designer and consulting artist for the Imperial Theaters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. At this exhibit this summer in Moscow, there was a huge theater backdrop that they had gotten, and apparently many years ago, like around the turn of the century, one of the opera singers in one of these stage presentations bought the entire set after the performance, which included the backdrop and all the costumes and the shoes, because Korovin designed everything. He designed the costumes, he designed advertisements, he designed the shoes, of course, the whole 9 yards. So anyway, this opera singer bought it, and he passed it on to his children, and then time went by, and the children, sometime after, well after World War II, they sold this all these materials at a yard sale outside of Paris. And of all people that happened to be walking by and seeing this yard sale was one of good old Polanov's grandchildren. Remember, Polanov is one of Korovin's teachers. And anyway, Polanov's grandchildren recognized what this was, and they bought it, and then they ended up giving it to the Pushkin Museum, which is in Moscow. It's interesting to note that this sketch of Kahn's wife sold at Christie's for £5,479 in 2010, and you can see it's just a little sketch. During World War I, Korovin worked as a camouflage consultant for the Russian army. So he continued on. Another important fact about Korovin is that he loved Paris, and he went to Paris almost every year of his life. This painting, Paris Café, is one of the first paintings I ever saw of his work. I took this picture at the main Trefikov gallery, and I was really impressed with the brushwork, the color. It's probably just a quick sketch for Korovin. And I think you can also notice that the color in this painting, it's very similar to if you look at Degas' work, very similar color palette. So Korovin painted Paris, during the day, at breakfast time, at night, during the rain, all different points of view, up on the top of a roof. If you remember, Pissarro was painting Paris from this rooftop, and they had their Impressionist show, I believe was the first one, where it was from the photographer's studio, and they first looked down onto these Paris streets, and you can see that really the influence of Pissarro and Monet on Korovin when you look through these paintings of Paris. This beautiful painting in the south of France is also at the Trefikov, and just gorgeous color palette and just the freedom of the brushwork. It's practically abstract, just brings in a few representational things, but he does it so well. Korovin loved the Crimea area, which is near the Black Sea in southern Russia. And he also loved the out-of-doors. He had a house in a place called Gursef, which is in the Ukraine. And he loved to fish, he loved the ocean, he loved water. And so what you'll see a lot of are these just beautiful landscape paintings of the area in Crimea, this cafe in Yalta, absolutely one of the most beautiful paintings in the world. Again, to me, when I look at this, I see a lot of Degas' influence. You can certainly see all of the Impressionist influence, but the color to me looks like Degas' work. I love the freshness. The one thing about Korovin, and I'll get into that a little bit more later, is he's not really working with broken color. He's just directly applying brush strokes, thick paint, and strong brushwork going in one direction, as opposed to like Pissarro and Monet, who were working with a lot of broken color. Between 1910 and 1917, Korovin lived at his country residence in Gursov for a long time, and he painted lots of canvases during that time of not only the landscapes, but a number of still lifes. You can see a real shift in his color palette in these paintings that are in the Crimea area. It has really a feeling of Greece and the Mediterranean, these blues, very intense colors, soft pinks, soft blues, pastel colors. He was definitely a real people person, and people enjoyed being around him, and he enjoyed people. So you'll see a lot of scenes of people enjoying themselves in the out of doors. In regards to his still lifes, they can be divided up into two categories: flowers and fish. And we know that he was an avid and passionate fisherman. So on his fish paintings, he actually, on the back of the canvases, he would write the size of the fish. One thing about this one painting called Fish, Wine, and Fruit, probably three of his most favorite things. This is called a nocturnal still life, which means that it was painted at night. And you have to remember that Korovin loved the theater. He worked in the theater. The theater was really a big part of his life. It was the way he made his living. So he started playing around with this idea of painting still lifes at night. And I wish you could see this painting better. When you look at the real painting in life, it's just absolutely amazing. Again, he's using really thick brush strokes. I think he's using a flat brush, and he's directing the brush strokes in the shape of the form. He's not working so much with broken color, and the color is highlighted through the lighting of the nighttime. As I said before, Korovin was a people person, and he loved people, and he did a number of very formal portrait paintings, and I've sort of saved them toward the last. And he worked in theater, so he painted a lot of actresses and opera singers. This first one is of actress Tatiana. I'm not going to even try to pronounce her last name. And again, done in a very impressionistic style. Very strong brush work, thick paint, a lot of impasto work in his paintings. This is a portrait of Princess Sophia. Her family name is it's Snaya, probably mispronounced, and she married into the Stroganov family. She married Count Alexander Stroganov. She was brought up abroad, and when she came back to Russia, married the Count, she ran a salon in her home in St. Petersburg, where there would come writers and poets, leading poets and writers of the day, and she supported them. She was a very big supporter of the arts. This is a really gorgeous painting that Korovin did with just a really gorgeous color palette, warm colors, even though it's sort of overall cool. This is positioned in the Trefikov Gallery where the symbolist painters have their work. This has got sort of that cool color palette that you saw. This was a little bit before the symbolist painters, actually, as far as time is concerned, but again, the brushwork is going in the direction of form. It's a lot of thick impasto work. Next is Nikolai Shakov, and I don't know that much about him, but his brother was a very famous priest. Next is the very famous collector Ivan Morozov. This is one of my favorite portraits in all the world, and I'm sorry that I can't get this painting photographed better. In the Trefikov Gallery, they're starting to put glass on top of their paintings, and the glass, of course, reflects all the other paintings because it's very cheap glass. But I've tried to show you the thick impasto paint on the white shirt, and then the way he paints on the face, you can see the direction of the form with the brush strokes. This is a portrait of the famous actor Shalapin, and these guys were very good friends, and he actually painted this on a trip that they went to together to Vichy, and they stayed in one of the best rooms and of course had a lot of fun. And here you see Korovin using very warm colors. It's very inviting, very loose painting style. He had a number of women in his life. I don't know the name of his wife. I'm not sure if this actress Nadezhda is her. I'm not sure. I like this painting because of the loose style it's painted in. And then this, his marriage was very unhappy, and I do know that he did have a relationship with this singer, Vera, and I believe it was a long-term relationship, though he always stayed married to his wife. This was one of the large portraits at this show this summer of Pertesva, which I thought was just really beautifully done. He has such motion to his work. And then this last portrait of Chalapin again, also very, very well done. During this time he was teaching at the Moscow School of Painting and Architecture, and you can really see the master control of drawing and brushwork and color, the way the vest matches the color in the background and the tone of the pants is similar to the vest. It's a very mature work. I'm showing you this painting too in a chair. Korovin never really got into abstract painting, but this is sort of some of the closest that he got to it, where he's really simplifying form. You can start to see it here. And then this is one of his last paintings he ever did, Boulevard in Paris, before his death. And then this was a self-portrait that he did right before he died. At the end here, I wanted to show you some of the paintings that he did of Russia. These very typical procession of people in the wintertime in Russia. And then this lovely piece, this is from the Kremlin. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior is a very famous church in the Kremlin. And the Kremlin is up on a hill, so it's sort of looking down. Very impressionistic feeling to this painting. And then this beautiful piece of the Moscow River Bridge, looking onto, you can see Red Square over to the left, and then the Church of the Savior is in the far left top corner, and then in the middle of the painting is the St. Basil. And then we've got Old Moscow. So the history of Russian Impressionism is associated with Korovin's paintings. He's characterized by an impulsive and spontaneity type style. With his work, you can see now that he intentionally did not fully render his subjects, and he did not fully finish the painting, so he left them with this feeling of spontaneity. His paintings are very creative, they're very charming, and he really had a feeling of light to them. He described his sort of theory on creativity on his 50th anniversary by saying this: "My major and only ever pursued purpose in art was beauty, aesthetic influence on the viewer, the fascination of color and shapes. No lecturing, no moral tendency to anybody ever." In 1923, Korovin immigrated permanently to Paris, and in 1939 he died there.